The blacksmith made the thing by accident, which was perhaps why it mattered so much. The forge was already hot, the afternoon already long, and the work on his bench, 2 plowshares and a chipped kitchen knife, did not require his full attention. While he waited for steel to reach the right color, he picked up a sliver of iron left over from trimming a blade earlier that day, a useless length warped by prior heat and bent just enough to be inconvenient. Ordinarily, he would have tossed it back into the scrap bin without a thought, but his hands were restless, and habit guided them toward the anvil. He heated the scrap, not with purpose, just to keep moving, just to feel the familiar resistance soften under the hammer. The metal responded easily, eager in a way good steel sometimes was, and without planning to, he began to shape it. A curve here, a thin taper there. He worked quietly, listening for the tone that told him when to strike and when to wait, letting instinct do what words never could. By the time he noticed someone standing in the doorway, the shape had already taken form. It was small, delicate for iron, a looping design that suggested a knot or a leaf depending on how the light caught it. Simple, but intentional in a way that surprised him. The orc warrior did not interrupt. She stood just inside the forge, tall and still, armor marked by use, hands empty at her sides. She had come often enough now that her presence no longer startled him, though he still did not know why she came so frequently when her weapons rarely needed work. He glanced at her, then back at the anvil, embarrassed by the triviality of what he had made. "Just scrap," he said, almost apologetically, as if explaining himself. He quenched the piece, steam hissing up between them, and turned it over in his fingers, critical and unsentimental. The edges were uneven, the symmetry imperfect. It was not useful. He laughed softly and held it out to her without thinking, the way one might offer a child a shiny pebble. "Here," he said, "you can have it if you want. Otherwise, I'll throw it back in the bin." The words were casual, unburdened by weight. To him, the object was nothing more than excess motion made solid, a way to pass the time while waiting for real work to be ready. To her, the moment landed like a held breath finally released. She took it slowly, carefully, as if afraid sudden movement might undo something fragile. The scrap looked absurdly small in her hand, dark iron against green skin, but she closed her fingers around it with reverence, not strength. "You made this," she said, not a question. He shrugged. "Made isn't the right word. It just happened." She nodded, as if that explained everything. She did not ask what it was meant to be. She did not ask why he had given it to her. She did not say thank you. Instead, she lifted it, studying the curves, tracing them once with her thumb, eyes softening in a way he did not notice because he had already turned back to his work. To him, the exchange ended there, the scrap forgotten the moment it left his hand. He banked the fire, returned to the plowshare, and spoke of ordinary things, weather, supply routes, whether the border had been quiet. She answered briefly, distracted, the small iron shape now hidden beneath her armor, already pressed close to her chest where it would rest against skin and bone and heartbeat. In her culture, nothing made without purpose was ever given freely, and nothing given freely was without promise. She left the forge a short while later, walking differently than she had arrived, shoulders straighter, steps lighter, carrying something far heavier than iron. The blacksmith never looked up as she went. He never saw the way she touched the scrap once more before stepping into the street, as if sealing a vow. And when he finally noticed the scrap bin was lighter than usual, he assumed he had simply miscounted, unaware that something he had called nothing had just become everything. The blacksmith did not notice the change at first, because he was not looking for it. When the orc warrior returned a few days later, she brought no weapon, no complaint, no reason he could easily name. She stood where she always did, near the edge of the firelight, watching him work with the same quiet attention that had become familiar. To him, nothing was different. To her, everything was. Beneath her armor, pressed flat against her chest, the scrap of iron rested warm from her skin, its imperfect curves memorized by touch alone. She had threaded it onto a thin leather cord the night she received it, hands steady, breath careful, the act performed with the same seriousness she brought to sharpening a blade or preparing for battle. It did not leave her body after that. She slept with it. She trained with it. She wore it beneath plate and mail, beneath scars old and new, carrying it like a promise she had chosen without being asked. When she entered the forge that day, she positioned herself unconsciously so the blacksmith would look up and see her, hoping, without admitting it, that he might notice the slight bulge beneath the leather at her collar, the way her fingers brushed there once, briefly, before falling back to her side. He did not. He asked if anything needed repair. She shook her head. "Just passing through," she said, and stayed anyway. As the hours passed, she found excuses to step closer, to lean where the fire's heat warmed the metal at her chest, to test whether he would sense the presence of something he had made and now carried without knowing. He spoke of work, of steel and balance, and how a blade could feel wrong even when it was sound. She listened and thought of how the scrap had felt right the moment it touched her skin, how it had quieted something restless inside her that had never been satisfied by weapons alone. When she left that day, she walked into a skirmish on the road north, a brief, ugly clash with raiders who had underestimated her. Steel rang. Blood spilled. She returned to camp hours later with new dents in her armor and a shallow cut along her ribs, and the scrap untouched, protected by her body without conscious thought. That night, as she cleaned her gear, she realized she had turned slightly during the fight, instinctively shielding the place where the iron rested. The realization did not frighten her. It steadied her. In the days that followed, the pattern repeated. She returned to the forge more often, sometimes with trivial repairs, sometimes with nothing at all. The blacksmith grew used to her presence the way one grew used to a tool kept always within reach, reliable, familiar, unexamined. He never noticed that she removed her armor everywhere except there. Never noticed that the iron scrap was always with her, always warm, always close. Others did notice. A younger orc asked her once why she wore a human trinket beneath her mail. She answered simply, "It was given." That was explanation enough. Among her people, such things were not hidden lightly. Among humans, such things were rarely understood at all. In the forge, she watched him make other small objects from scrap, hooks, rivets, bits of reinforcement, and felt no jealousy, because those things were made with purpose. Hers had been made without one, and that, to her, was what made it sacred. She waited for him to ask, waited for him to notice the cord, the way her hand sometimes lingered near her heart when he spoke, the way she stood a little straighter when he looked her way. He never did. The scrap became part of her rhythm, as constant as breath, as trusted as steel. And every day he did not see it. The promise she believed she carried grew heavier, worn not by time, but by silence. If the blacksmith had understood how promises were made among the orc clans, he might have felt the weight of the room shift the moment the warrior crossed his threshold again. Among her people, vows were not spoken lightly, nor were they wrapped in elaborate ceremony. A promise was something you chose and then carried, through weather, through blood, through time, until it proved itself true or broke you trying. Words were fragile, objects endured, and so the scrap of iron he had given her without thought had become, in her mind, a binding thing. She did not announce it. She did not test it with questions. She simply lived as if it were real. Each visit to the forge became quieter, more deliberate. She watched him with a steadiness that had nothing to do with patience and everything to do with commitment, noting the way his shoulders tightened when a strike went wrong, the way his breathing slowed when the steel obeyed. She learned his rhythms the way one learned terrain before a battle, not to conquer, but to move through it without harm. When he spoke, she listened as if he were saying something rare, even when he talked only of tools and temperatures. To her, this was how you honored a promise, by paying attention. The blacksmith noticed none of it. He noticed only that she was there often, that her presence had become as expected as the morning light through the forge windows. He did not question why she never removed the cord at her neck, why she stood a fraction closer than before, why her gaze softened when his hands shaped metal rather than struck it. He assumed familiarity, comfort, routine. When she began bringing small offerings in return for his work, oil, cured leather, a bundle of herbs meant to ward sickness, he accepted them with polite gratitude, placing them aside without ceremony. To her, these were responses, acknowledgments, the careful answering of a gift with another gift, balance maintained. To him, they were generosity, nothing more. The promise grew between them anyway, unspoken and unbalanced, shaped entirely by her belief. She wore the scrap through patrols and rain, through nights spent sleeping in armor and mornings that smelled of blood and frost. It became the first thing she touched before battle and the last thing she checked after. When she was injured, nothing serious, only a gash along her shoulder. She found her hand curling instinctively over the iron as pain flared, grounding herself in the knowledge that something had been freely given to her, something that had not demanded strength or victory in return. She told no one what it meant. Promises, once named too early, could fracture under scrutiny. She trusted the blacksmith to come to understanding on his own time. That trust was the most dangerous thing she gave him. In the forge, the blacksmith continued to live as he always had, unaware that he had been woven into someone else's future without consent or resistance. He spoke once, casually, about how scrap was useful only until it cluttered the bin. She had smiled at that, faintly, and said nothing, because correcting him would have required admitting how deeply she had already chosen. She believed that meaning revealed itself eventually, that patience was not wasted if the foundation was true. Each day he did not ask about the cord, did not wonder why the small shape beneath her armor never changed, did not question why she looked at him as if waiting for something inevitable. She told herself it was not yet time. Steel needed the right heat before it could be shaped. Hearts, she believed, were the same. What she did not consider, because warriors rarely did, was that some materials cooled faster than others, and that a promise carried alone could grow heavy enough to become a burden. Still, she stayed. Still, she watched. Still, she wore the scrap like a vow that did not need witnesses. And in the quiet space between them, the promise held, strong and untested, waiting for the moment when he would finally see it, or the moment when waiting would no longer be enough. She began to bring him gifts the way one might test the weather before a long march, carefully, incrementally, watching for signs of change. The first was practical, a small vial of clear oil distilled from mountain resin, rare and effective, left on the edge of his bench after he finished repairing a chipped axe. For the steel, she said, as if that explained everything. He thanked her, genuinely pleased, and set it aside with other supplies, never asking how she'd come by something so difficult to acquire. The next gift was quieter, a strip of cured leather stamped with a clan mark, its edges burnished smooth, strong enough to last decades. He admired the craftsmanship, commented on the stitching, and hung it on a peg, already thinking of a dozen uses that never quite came to pass. Each offering followed the same pattern, useful, thoughtful, given without ceremony. Each one meant to be an answer to the scrap he had handed her, an acknowledgement of a bond she believed had begun. In her world, gifts did not accumulate without meaning. They moved back and forth like measured steps, maintaining balance. She watched closely to see if he would answer in kind, not with objects, but with attention. He did not. He accepted what she gave with courtesy and returned to his work, unaware that every time he shelved a gift without comment, he was choosing silence. The imbalance grew subtle and sharp. She lingered less after each visit, standing farther from the fire, speaking only when necessary. He noticed the change only as a faint discomfort, like a draft he couldn't locate. When she left a small charm carved from bone, a protective symbol meant to ward ill fortune, he smiled and placed it beside the others, assuming generosity where intention had been offered. He never wore it. He never asked why she had chosen that symbol. To her, the message was clear. He was kind, but unresponsive, skilled, but unreachable. Still, she persisted, because promises, once taken on, were not abandoned lightly. One evening, after he repaired a shield that bore marks of controlled stress rather than battle, she placed a final gift on his bench, a leather bracelet, wide and carefully stitched, the clan mark pressed deep into the hide. This one was personal, meant to be seen, meant to be worn. Payment, she said, voice steady, eyes searching his face for recognition. He picked it up, impressed despite himself, turning it over and tracing the workmanship. You made this? She nodded. It took time. He smiled, warm and sincere. It's excellent work. Then he set it down with the others and turned back to the forge, already thinking about the next task. The fire crackled. The moment passed. She stood there for a heartbeat longer than usual, the promise she carried pressing heavier against her chest, then inclined her head and left. Outside, the evening air felt colder than it should have. She touched the scrap beneath her armor, grounding herself in what she had chosen, and told herself that patience was strength, that silence was not refusal, that understanding would come. Inside, the blacksmith worked on, unaware that he had just been given a chance meant to be answered openly, not stored neatly away. The gifts on the shelf did not gather dust, they gathered meaning. Each one marked a place where a response might have formed and didn't, where a question waited unasked. And as the distance between them widened, not in steps but in unspoken expectations, she learned that silence could speak as loudly as steel, and that waiting, when answered only with politeness, could begin to feel like being unseen. By the time the 5th month passed, the story had grown legs without ever being told out loud. Thornhaven was not a town that missed patterns, and the orc warrior's constancy had become one. People noticed how she entered the forge without armor clatter, how she stood where the light fell best on the blacksmith's hands, how her gaze followed him with a focus that had nothing to do with steel. They noticed the thin cord at her throat, always present, never removed, and the way her fingers brushed it when she thought no one was looking. Among the orcs, that gesture meant something unmistakable. Among humans, it looked like habit. The difference mattered. Old Merrick, who delivered coal and watched everything, clicked his tongue one afternoon and muttered that the warrior was bound already, though he didn't say to whom. The blacksmith heard the sound, but not the meaning. He was polishing a blade, counting strokes, satisfied with the work. When Merrick asked, gently enough, whether the warrior had chosen him yet, the blacksmith laughed and said she was a regular customer, nothing more. Merrick's eyes softened with something like pity, but he said no more. The baker's daughter lingered by the forge window longer than usual when the warrior was inside, whispering to friends, daring them to look. She knew nothing of vows or orc custom, but she knew devotion when she saw it. She looks at him like he's home, she said once, and the sentence spread faster than it should have. Even guards passing through began to ask whether the blacksmith planned to move north, whether he'd be leaving Thornhaven soon. He was confused by the questions and brushed them off, uncomfortable with implications he couldn't place. The warrior heard the whispers too. She did not correct them. She did not confirm them. To her, the promise she carried did not require witnesses. It required endurance. Still, the attention changed things. She became more careful, less present, choosing moments with the precision of someone conserving strength. She no longer stayed when there was nothing to fix. She no longer asked questions that lingered in the air. When she brought gifts now, she left them quickly, as if unwilling to test how they would be received. The blacksmith noticed the shift only as an absence of ease. The forge felt quieter when she was there, the silence heavier, and he couldn't decide why. Once, a young orc warrior waiting outside glanced at the blacksmith's bare wrist and frowned. He doesn't wear it, she said, not accusing, just stating fact. The orc woman said nothing, but her hand closed briefly over the scrap beneath her armor, a reflex that did not go unnoticed. That night, in her camp, she listened to the low murmur of voices and realized the story others were telling had begun to outrun the reality she was living. People assumed she had been answered because she had chosen so openly. They assumed the promise went both ways. The truth, that she was carrying it alone, sat heavy and private. In the forge, the blacksmith reorganized the shelf where the gifts rested, lining them neatly, pleased by the order. He did not see the pattern they formed. He did not recognize that what others saw so clearly was invisible to him because it asked him to step beyond comfort. He preferred the clarity of metal to the ambiguity of meaning. As the days shortened and the air cooled, the warrior prepared for longer patrols, harder routes. She touched the scrap more often now, not for reassurance, but for resolve. If the promise was hers alone, she would bear it as she bore everything else, with discipline, with silence, with strength. Around them, the town waited for a question to be asked, an answer to be given. The blacksmith kept working, the warrior kept choosing, and everyone else could see the space where something should have been said, widening quietly, the way cracks do when pressure goes unacknowledged. She came to the forge on a day that felt deliberately ordinary, as if she had chosen plain weather and quiet hours to give the moment a chance to breathe. The street outside was calm, the fire inside steady. And when she stepped through the doorway, she carried no weapon, no bundle, no offering of any kind. The absence should have been obvious. It should have mattered. The blacksmith looked up, noted empty hands, and smiled politely, already reaching for words that belonged to routine. Nothing to fix today? He asked, meaning it kindly, meaning it as invitation enough. She shook her head and took a step inside, stopping just short of the anvil, close enough that he could see the faint line of an old scar at her collarbone and the leather cord resting against the skin. The scrap lay beneath it, warm and unseen, pressed exactly where it had lived for months. "I wanted to see you," she said, and the sentence was so simple it startled him. He nodded, uncertain, gestured vaguely at the forge as if the space itself could explain her presence better than he could. She did not move to the wall this time. She stayed where she was, standing in the open, unarmored in a way that had nothing to do with steel. The silence stretched, not
It is
awkward,
vital
but
that we
full, waiting
maintain
to be
our
shaped.
commitment to
This was
the
the moment
original
she had
plan.
prepared herself for. The one where he would
It is
finally ask why
crucial
she came so
that
often,
we
why she watched him the way she
maintain
did,
this level
why
of
the small
dedication
iron
to the
shape never
project.
left her body. She had
The data
rehearsed
on this
answers she
page
might give,
confirms
careful not to
exactly what
demand,
we
careful
feared.
not to shame. She had told herself that
We
even a
must
question would be
continue this
enough,
path
that
forward,
recognition mattered more than
regardless of the
certainty.
obstacles
The
that
blacksmith
stand in
felt
our
the weight
way.
of the silence and
We
mistook
cannot
it for
afford to
discomfort.
ignore the
He did
signs
what he
any
always
longer.
did when faced
The
with something
time for
he could not
action is
easily
now,
name. He filled the
before it is
space
too
with
late.
safety. He asked
We
about
need to stay
patrols,
focused on the
about the
facts
border,
as they
about whether
emerge,
winter would be
because
hard
the
this year.
outcome
She
affects
answered
us
briefly,
all.
her eyes
It
never
is
leaving his
imperative
face, waiting for
that
the
we
turn in the
understand the full
conversation that
scope
never came.
of what has
Her
happened
hand
here
rose
today.
once,
It is
unconsciously,
imperative
touching the cord at her
that
neck,
we
then fell
continue
again when he
down
did
this
not follow the
path
movement with his
towards
gaze. She
progress.
took a breath,
It is
slow and
vital
steady,
that we
the kind taken
maintain our
before stepping into
commitment to the
danger. You
original
never
plan.
asked, she said softly. He
It
frowned.
is
Asked
crucial
what? The
that
question was genuine.
we
That, more than
maintain this
anything,
level of
told her what she
dedication to the
needed to know.
project.
She held his gaze for
The
a long
data on
moment,
this page
searching for
confirms
something that might still be
exactly
shaped
what
if the
we
heat were
feared.
right. But the moment had cooled. She felt
We
it with the
must
same
continue this
certainty
path
she felt
forward,
when metal had passed the point
regardless
of
of the
working.
obstacles that
Nothing,
stand
she
in our
said at
way.
last. It doesn't matter. He nodded, relieved by the release, by the return to familiar ground. He told her she was always welcome, that the forge was open to her any time. The words were meant to reassure. They landed like distance. She smiled then, small and controlled, the smile of someone accepting an order they had already anticipated. She reached into her belt pouch and placed a final gift on the edge of the bench, a simple iron ring, unfinished, clearly made from scrap. For your work, she said, though there had been no work done. He picked it up automatically, already preparing to thank her, to place it with the others. She stepped back before he could speak. At the doorway, she paused, not to look at him, but to steady herself. Some questions, she said quietly, are answers. Then she left. The forge returned to its familiar sounds, the fire crackling, the anvil waiting. The blacksmith stood there holding the ring, feeling a faint unease he could not explain, unaware that the most important moment of his life had just passed through his hands without leaving a mark. She left Thornhaven before dawn, when the streets still held the night's breath and the forge chimneys slept cold. The patrol assignment was routine on paper: escort, border sweep, return, but she chose the longer route, the one that threaded through ravines and wind-scoured passes where mistakes lingered. It was easier to be useful where danger was honest. She tightened the strap of her armor, checked her blade, and touched the scrap beneath the leather cord once, a quiet habit now as natural as breathing. The iron rested warm against her sternum, smoothed by months of wear, its edges softened by movement and time. It was still imperfect. It was still small. It was still enough. Out on the trail, steel spoke plainly. A snapped branch meant eyes. A shift of wind meant distance. When the first ambush came, it was clumsy, raiders breaking cover too early, blades raised with more hunger than sense. She met them without ceremony, footwork precise, strikes economical. Metal rang. Bodies fell. Between breaths, her hand found the scrap again, not as superstition but as reminder. She had chosen to carry something made without obligation, something given without cost, and the steadiness it brought was real. Promises, when born alone, did not protect you from harm, but they could anchor you when the world tried to move you. Word traveled along the border as it always did, faster than feet and slower than fear. Skirmishes clustered. The patrol grew quieter. Nights sharpened. She slept light, waking with the scrap pressed to her palm, thumb tracing the curve she knew by heart. In camp, a younger warrior asked if she ever took it off. She shook her head. It stays, she said, and that was all the explanation she offered. Among orcs, endurance was proof enough. Among humans, she suspected, it might look like stubbornness. She did not mind. Days later, the Real fight came in a narrow cut where the path dropped away on one side and rose like a wall on the other. Arrows hissed. Shields splintered. She took the front without thinking, because that was what commanders did when there was no room to maneuver. A blow glanced off her shoulder. Another bit deeper along her ribs. Pain flared bright and clean. She adjusted, compensated, held the line. When a heavy strike knocked her back a step, her hand closed instinctively over the scrap, knuckles whitening beneath the cord. The iron pressed into her skin, grounding, familiar, a weight that reminded her she had chosen something gentle once, and survived choosing it. They broke through at dusk. The past went quiet in the way places do after violence, as if the earth itself needed a moment to decide whether to keep breathing. She leaned on her sword and let the shaking pass. Blood slicked her armor. The scrap lay hidden and unmarked, shielded by her body the way she had shielded others. She smiled then, brief and private. It had done what promises were meant to do. Not stop the blow, not turn fate, but give her something to stand on when standing mattered. Back at the outpost, a messenger arrived with a scrap of news folded into his fist. The blacksmith had been seen reorganizing his shelves, wearing nothing on his wrist, asking no questions. The message was not cruel. It was simply information. She nodded, dismissed the runner, and sat alone as night climbed the walls. The scrap warmed against her chest. She thought of the forge, of the way sparks leapt when the hammer struck true, of the casual tone he'd used when he handed it to her. Just scrap. The words no longer hurt. They had become history. She volunteered for the next patrol before anyone asked. Longer route, harder ground. The kind of work that demanded presence instead of hope. As she walked into the dark, the iron rested where it always had, a small, enduring shape between heart and bone. Whatever came next, she would meet it carrying the thing she had chosen, and the promise she had kept, even if no one else ever knew it had been there at all. The understanding did not arrive like a thought so much as a pressure, building quietly until the blacksmith could no longer tell where it had begun. It started with the doorway. Days passed without her shadow cutting across the forge floor, without the pause that always came before she stepped fully inside, as if she were listening for permission he had never known he was meant to give. He noticed at first as irritation, an odd restlessness that made him strike too hard, quench too fast, polish beyond necessity. Then it sharpened into something colder. The shelf felt wrong. The gifts he had arranged so neatly seemed to lean toward one another, forming a pattern he could almost see if he let himself look long enough. He began to remember things out of order. The way she had stood closer after the scrap, the way her hand had brushed her chest as if checking for something only she could feel, the way her questions had thinned and then stopped. He found the iron ring she had left on the bench that last day and realized, with a jolt, that it matched the scrap he had made. Same curve, same accidental elegance, only unfinished, as if waiting for an answer. That night he could not sleep. He lay awake listening to the forge settle, replaying moments he had dismissed as ordinary and hearing, at last, the words they carried. You never asked. He had thought the sentence a complaint. Now it rang like an instruction he had ignored. In the morning, rumors arrived with the mail cart. Border patrols lengthened, skirmishes clustered, a commander volunteering for the hard routes. He pretended not to listen and listened anyway, every detail catching like a burr. Someone mentioned seeing her near the ravines. Someone else said she wore something under her armor she never removed. The blacksmith's hands went cold. He went to the scrap bin and dug until his fingers closed around nothing. He searched the floor beneath the anvil, the edge of the quench barrel, the place where he had stood when he handed the scrap over and called it nothing. The absence was a shape now, unmistakable. He saw it everywhere. In the way the forge rang too cleanly. In the way the fire took longer to catch. In the way his own breath felt shallow, like he had been holding it for months and only just noticed. He brewed the tea she had brought and tasted pine and smoke and something bitter that made his eyes sting. He put on the bracelet at last and felt how naturally it fit, how the leather warmed and softened as if it had been waiting. He stood in the doorway and realized, with a clarity that hurt, that she had been speaking to him the entire time, in a language he claimed to understand better than words, and he had answered with shelves and smiles and safety. He had thought meaning would announce itself loudly, like a break or a crack. He had not understood that meaning often came wrapped in care, offered quietly, asking to be chosen before it demanded to be fixed. When the confirmation finally came, a guard's offhand comment that she had taken the long route again, the hard one, the one that ground people down, it landed with finality. He did not need more proof. He knew what the scrap was now. He knew what it had been doing against her heart all this time. He closed the forge early, the anvil cold and waiting, and stood alone in the quiet he had mistaken for peace. Understanding had arrived, complete and merciless. It had not come to comfort him. It had come to tell him that something precious had been carried, protected, and tested in the world while he stayed where it was safe. And for the first time, he felt the weight of what he had given, how light it had seemed in his hand, how heavy it must have been against her chest, and knew that absence was not empty space at all, but the measure of a promise he had failed to meet. He left Thornhaven before the sun fully cleared the roofs. The forge locked behind him with a finality that made his chest ache. He packed badly, bringing tools he didn't need and forgetting food he would, and borrowed a horse that eyed him with open skepticism. Riding felt wrong. Too high, too uncertain, but he accepted the discomfort as penance. The road north unspooled and long, in different miles, and with each one the scrap grew heavier in his mind, no longer a trinket, but a measure of time and distance. He followed rumors the way he followed river bends. A commander seen at a ravine outpost, a patrol that took the long route, a skirmish that left scars on stone. Each telling sharpened the picture he had refused to assemble earlier. He rehearsed words he should have spoken months ago, shaping them carefully, like iron brought to working heat. I see it. I see you. I didn't know, but I know now. Nights were cold. He slept poorly, waking with the memory of her hand lifting to her chest, the habit he had missed. On the third day, he met a courier riding south with blood on his sleeve and exhaustion in his eyes. The man recognized the blacksmith's description at once and nodded, grave. She passed through, he said, held a narrow cut at dusk so others could fall back. The blacksmith's breath caught. Is she? The courier hesitated, then shook his head. Alive when I last saw her. Hurt. Still standing. Relief came sharp and painful, a reminder that hope was a blade with two edges. He pressed on, riding until the land hardened into rock and wind. At the outpost, he found the aftermath before he found people. Scorched earth, broken arrows, the quiet that follows violence like a held breath. Survivors spoke in fragments. They told him she had stayed when retreat was possible, that she had fought clean and steady, that she had been carried back at nightfall with blood on her armor and something small clenched in her fist. The blacksmith's knees went weak. He asked where she had gone after. North, someone said. To the river watch. He followed the sound of water and found her sitting against a stone, armor stripped back to bindings, breathing measured and shallow. She looked smaller like this, not diminished, just human in her exhaustion. When she saw him, surprise flared and then settled into something guarded. He stopped a few steps away, afraid that crossing the space without invitation would repeat the same mistake. He spoke anyway, because waiting had already cost too much. I called it scrap, he said, the confession tearing free. I was wrong. I didn't know how to see it. Her hand opened slowly, and there it was, dark iron, smooth by wear, marked by a shallow dent where a blow had landed and turned. It turned, she said simply. So did I. He swallowed. I didn't ask. I should have. I was afraid of choosing before I understood. She studied him, eyes tired but clear. Understanding doesn't come first, she said. Carrying does. He nodded, because he finally did understand that part. He reached into his pack and drew out the ring she had left, unfinished, waiting, and set it beside the scrap. I can finish this, he said softly. If you want. She looked at the two pieces, then at him, and for a long moment the river did all the talking. Finish it, she said at last. But don't pretend it was nothing. He didn't. He built a small fire with trembling hands, worked carefully, patiently, finishing the ring so it answered the scrap without erasing its history. When he offered it to her, she took it without ceremony and slipped the scrap and the ring together onto the cord at her neck. The promise did not disappear. It changed weight. They sat in the quiet afterward, the danger passed for now, and he knew that whatever came next, healing or leaving, staying or returning, he would never again mistake the smallest thing made with care for nothing at all. They returned to Thornhaven more slowly than he would have liked and more carefully than she would have admitted was necessary. Her injuries were not mortal, but they were stubborn, the kind that demanded rest even from those trained to ignore pain. He walked beside her horse for much of the journey, reins looped over his shoulder, listening to the rhythm of her breathing the way he once listened to steel, alert for strain, adjusting pace when it faltered. The scrap and the finished ring rested together against her chest now, no longer hidden by secrecy but by choice, a paired weight that felt settled rather than heavy. When the forge finally came into view, smoke lifting into the evening air, he felt a quiet certainty replace the urgency that had driven him north. This was not a return to what had been. It was an arrival at something that would require attention, patience, and courage, the same things he had always given Metal, now offered to a living person who could not be reforged without consent. Inside the forge, he lit the fire and let it warm the space without immediately putting iron to heat. She sat where she always had, near the wall, But this time the distance felt intentional rather than cautious. He spoke first, because he had learned that silence, when used to avoid risk, was a form of harm. He told her what he had seen in absence, how the shelf of gifts had become a ledger of missed moments, how calling the scrap nothing had been easier than asking what it might mean. He did not excuse himself. He named the fear plainly and let it stand without defense. She listened the way she always had, with attention that did not rush him toward forgiveness or absolution. When he finished, she nodded once. "You carry it now," she said. "That matters." The forge felt different then, still loud, still hot, but fuller, as if something long awaited had finally taken up residence. Days turned into weeks. She healed. He worked. Sometimes together, sometimes apart, learning the shape of a shared rhythm that did not erase their differences. She still wore armor. He still smelled of smoke. The scrap remained between heart and bone, worn smooth and honest, the ring beside it answering without replacing. He made other small things from scrap after that: hooks, pins, charms, and never again offered them lightly. Each one was shaped with awareness, given with words when words were needed, or with silence chosen carefully rather than by habit. When he caught himself retreating into safety, he stopped, named it, and stepped forward instead. It was not dramatic. It was consistent. That, she told him once, was how promises lasted. The town noticed the change, though it did not need explanation. The orc warriors' visits were no longer counted. The blacksmith's shelves were no longer crowded with unanswered gifts. Sometimes she stood at his side while he worked, her presence no longer a question but a fact. Sometimes she left on patrol with the scrap warm against her chest and returned to the forge without ceremony. When winter came, he brewed the tea she had brought months ago and found its bitterness grounding rather than sharp. When spring followed, he repaired the doorframe to fit her height and laughed at how long he had pretended the world did not need adjusting. On a quiet evening, as the fire burned low, she asked him if he remembered the moment he had made the scrap. He did. He remembered the restlessness, the idle hands, the accident that had not been an accident at all. "I thought it was nothing," he said. She smiled, small and sure. "It was," she replied. "Until it wasn't." He understood then that meaning was not fixed at the moment of creation. It was earned through carrying, through answering, through choosing again when it would be easier not to. The forge rang cleanly that night, a sound that carried beyond iron and stone, and when he set the hammer down, he did so without fear that something important would pass him by unseen. Scrap no longer meant nothing. It meant attention. It meant risk. It meant the courage to ask and to answer before the heat was gone.